In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed old lady with a knack for secrets, steps into a chilling mystery at Willow Cottage. Clara's greenhouse, filled with rare plants, hides a dangerous secret. Formula X, a formula worth millions. When broken glass, poisoned orchids and threatening notes shatter the peace, Miss Marple unravels a web of greed and betrayal. A jealous scientist, an ambitious journalist, and a secretive lawyer circle Clara's work. But who's behind the sabotage? With her knitting and cunning, Miss Marple sets a trap, revealing a shadowy mastermind and saving Clara's dreams. Dive into a cozy yet thrilling tale where every petal hides a clue. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Willow Cottage. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in shades of gold and pink. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking like a steady heartbeat. Her cottage was cosy, with lace curtains fluttering in the late spring breeze and a fire crackling in the hearth. She was halfway through a soft blue scarf when the postman's bicycle bell jingled outside. A letter slid through the slot, landing on the rug with a soft thud. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her sharp eyes glinting with curiosity. Letters were rare these days, and this one had a fancy wax seal, the kind that hinted at something important. She picked it up, noting the crisp handwriting on the envelope. It was from Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a name that stirred memories of long ago, teas and garden parties. Clara had been a lively young woman then, always talking about plants and flowers, her hands stained with soil. Now, years later, she lived at Willow Cottage, a secluded house on the edge of the village. The letter was an invitation to spend the weekend, but its tone was odd, polite yet urgent, with a line about a delicate matter that needed Miss Marple's keen mind. Miss Marple's fingers traced the seal, a rose pressed into red wax. She smiled faintly. Delicate matters, in her experience, often hid thorny secrets. By noon, Miss Marple had packed a small suitcase. She tucked in her knitting, a spare shawl, and a notebook for jotting down thoughts. St. Mary Mead was quiet as she stepped outside, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The village seemed peaceful, with children playing near the duck pond and Mrs. Baker hanging laundry in her yard. But Miss Marple knew better. Villages like this were never as simple as they looked. She caught a ride with young Tommy, who drove the village's only taxi, a rattling old car that smelled of leather and pipe smoke. "Willow Cottage, please," she said, settling into the back seat. Tommy nodded, his cap tilted over one eye. "Odd place, that," he muttered. "Mrs. Henshaw keeps to herself, always fussing with that greenhouse of hers." The drive took them past rolling fields and hedgerows bursting with wildflowers. Willow Cottage came into view, a charming house with ivy climbing its stone walls. Its garden was a tangle of colours, roses, lavender, and tall foxgloves swaying in the breeze. But the greenhouse was the real sight. It stood at the back, a grand structure of glass and iron, its panes catching the sunlight like a giant jewel. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it. Something about its gleam felt watchful, almost alive. Clara Henshaw greeted her at the door, her face warm but lined with worry. She was older now, her auburn hair streaked with grey, but her eyes still sparkled with the energy of her youth. "Jane, "You're a dear for coming," she said, taking Miss Marple's hands. Her grip was firm, but her fingers trembled slightly. "It's been too long." She led Miss Marple inside, where the air smelled of polished wood and fresh roses. The sitting room was bright, with chintz curtains and a tea tray set out on a lace tablecloth. Clara poured tea, her movements quick, as if she couldn't quite settle. Over scones and jam, Clara explained the invitation. "It's the greenhouse," she said, her voice low. "Strange things have been happening. Tools moved when I know. I left them in place. Plants disturbed, like someone's been poking around. And sometimes, at night, I feel watched." She laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It sounds silly, I know, but I'm uneasy. I thought you, with your knack for seeing things others miss, might help." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her face calm, but her mind racing. She'd seen this before, small signs that pointed to bigger troubles. "Tell me about the greenhouse," she said gently. Clara's eyes lit up, and for a moment her worry faded. "It's my haven," she said. "I grow rare plants. Orchids, carnivorous ones, even some I've bred myself. I'm working on something special, a hybrid, funded by a private donor. It's delicate work and I can't afford mistakes." She paused, glancing toward the window. "But someone's been meddling, Jane. I'm sure of it." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles back in her hands, clicking softly. She asked about the other guests arriving for the weekend. Clara listed them. Dr. Lionel Vance, a fellow botanist with a sharp mind but a sharper temper. Sophie Trent, a young journalist writing about village life, and Mr. Reginald Poole, Clara's lawyer, who handled her donors' funds. "They're all connected to my work in some way," Clara said. "I trust them, but, well, I don't know any more." Miss Marple noted the hesitation. Trust, she knew, was a fragile thing in a village like St. Mary Mead. The afternoon passed quietly. Miss Marple settled into a guest room overlooking the garden, its window framing the greenhouse like a painting. She unpacked her suitcase, placing her notebook on the bedside table. Then she took a walk, her shawl draped over her shoulders. The garden was a delight, with paths winding through beds of daisies and hollyhocks. Bees buzzed lazily, and a blackbird sang from a willow tree. But the greenhouse drew her like a magnet. Up close, it was even grander, its glass walls misty with condensation. Through the panes she saw rows of plants, some with delicate petals, others with sharp, hungry leaves. A locked door at one end caught her eye, marked with a sign, "Private Research. Keep out." As she studied the door, a shadow moved inside. It was quick, gone before she could be sure, but Miss Marple's heart gave a little jump. She stepped closer, peering through the glass. The greenhouse was empty now, or so it seemed. A rake leaned against a bench, its handle slightly askew, as if someone had bumped it. She made a mental note, her mind already spinning a web of possibilities. Back at the house, Clara was preparing dinner, humming a tune that didn't match her tense shoulders. Miss Marple offered to help, slicing carrots while asking casual questions about the village. Clara mentioned Tom Biddle, her gardener, a quiet man who kept the grounds tidy but rarely spoke. "He's loyal," Clara said, "but he's been jumpy lately." The other guests arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon. Dr. Lionel Vance was a tall man with a bald head and a habit of adjusting his glasses every few seconds. He shook Miss Marple's hand with a grip that was too tight, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Heard you're good at solving puzzles," he said, his voice clipped. "Hope there's no need for that here." Miss Marple smiled politely, noting his quick glance toward the greenhouse. Sophie Trent was next, a lively young woman with short brown hair and a notebook tucked under her arm. She chatted eagerly about her article, asking Miss Marple about village gossip. Her questions were sharp, almost too sharp, as if she were fishing for something specific. Mr. Reginald Poole arrived last, a thin man in a grey suit, his face as stiff as his collar. He carried a leather briefcase and spoke in short, careful sentences. "Mrs. Henshaw's affairs are in order," he said when Clara introduced him. "No need for concern." But Miss Marple caught the way his fingers tightened on the briefcase, like he was guarding a secret. Dinner was a lively affair, with Clara serving roast chicken and potatoes. The conversation danced around plants, village events and the weather, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent. Lionel kept looking at Clara, as if waiting for her to say something. Sophie scribbled notes when she thought no one was watching. Reginald barely spoke, his eyes fixed on his plate. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room for coffee. Miss Marple took her usual spot by the fire, her knitting in her lap. She listened as Clara talked about her latest project, a rare orchid she hoped would bloom soon. "It's delicate," Clara said, her voice soft. "One wrong move, and it could die." Lionel snorted, muttering something about overhyped flowers. Sophie leaned forward, asking about the orchid's value. Reginald coughed, changing the subject to village taxes. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her ears catching every word, every pause. She thought of her neighbour, Mrs. Price, who once hid a stolen brooch in a flower pot. Small places, she knew, held big secrets. As the evening grew late, a sharp crack broke the quiet. It came from the garden, loud enough to make Clara spill her coffee. "The greenhouse!" she gasped, rushing to the door. The others followed, Miss Marple trailing behind, her steps slow but deliberate. Outside, the night was cool, the stars bright overhead. The greenhouse glowed faintly, its glass reflecting the moon. A single pane was shattered, jagged edges glinting. On the floor inside lay a brick, its surface rough and ordinary. Clara clutched her shawl, her face pale. "Vandals," she whispered. "It must be vandals." Miss Marple knelt by the broken pane, her eyes scanning the scene. The brick was heavy, with bits of dirt clinging to it. She glanced at the ground outside, no footprints, no scuff marks. Inside, the dirt was smooth, undisturbed. "Curious," she murmured, standing up. Lionel suggested calling the police, but Clara shook her head. "It's just a window," she said, though her voice trembled. Sophie was already taking photos with a small camera, her face eager. Reginald stood apart, his briefcase still in hand, as if he couldn't bear to let it go. Back inside, Clara offered everyone brandy to calm their nerves. Miss Marple declined, preferring tea. She sat quietly, watching the group. Lionel was pacing, his glasses slipping down his nose. Sophie was writing furiously, her pen scratching like a mouse. Reginald stared out the window, his face unreadable. Clara tried to smile, but it faltered. "I'm sorry, Jane," she said. This wasn't the welcome I planned." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Nonsense, my dear. A little excitement keeps one young." Alone in her room later, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle. The greenhouse loomed in the dark, its broken pane like a wound. She thought of the shadow she'd seen, the misplaced rake, the locked door. Clara's worry wasn't just about plants. Something deeper was at play. Miss Marple opened her notebook and wrote, "Brick thrown from inside, shadow in greenhouse, Lionel's nerves, Sophie's questions, Reginald's briefcase." She closed the book, her mind already weaving a pattern. St. Mary Mead, she knew, was full of secrets, and Willow Cottage was no exception. Tomorrow she would start unravelling them, one stitch at a time. Chapter 2. The Greenhouse Haven. The morning sun climbed over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the dew-kissed garden of Willow Cottage. Miss Jane Marple woke early, her internal clock as reliable as the village church bell. From her guest room window, she watched the greenhouse gleam like a crystal box, its glass walls catching the light in a way that seemed both beautiful and secretive. She dressed in a tweed skirt and a soft cardigan, tucking her knitting into a wicker basket. Her notebook, already marked with last night's observations, went in too. The broken pane and the brick still nagged at her like a dropped stitch in a scarf. Today, she decided, she would learn more about Clara's greenhouse and the people circling it like moths. Downstairs, the smell of fresh coffee and warm toast filled the air. Clara was in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour as she arranged a tray of scones. "Good morning, Jane," she said, her smile bright but strained, like a flower wilting at the edges. "I hope you slept well, despite everything." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but watchful. "Quite well, thank you. I thought I might take a closer look at your greenhouse today. It sounds like a marvel." Clara's face lit up, and for a moment her worry seemed to fade. "Oh, it is. I'll show you after breakfast. It's my pride and joy." The dining room was lively with the clink of teacups and the murmur of voices. Dr. Lionel Vance was already there, his bald head bent over a newspaper, though his eyes kept darting to the window. Sophie Trent sat across from him, her notebook open, scribbling as she nibbled a piece of toast. Mr. Reginald Poole entered last, his grey suit as crisp as ever, his briefcase tucked under his arm like a shield. Miss Marple took her seat, spreading a napkin over her lap. She noted the way Lionel's fingers twitched when Clara mentioned the greenhouse, and how Sophie's pen paused, as if waiting for something juicy to write down. Reginald, as usual, said little, but his gaze lingered on Clara with a flicker of concern. Breakfast was simple but hearty: eggs, bacon, and Clara's homemade scones with blackberry jam. The talk turned to village matters: the upcoming flower show, the new vicar's sermons, and the gossip about Mrs. Carter's runaway cat. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She steered the conversation gently, asking Clara about her plants. "Oh, they're my life," Clara said, her voice warm. "I've got orchids from South America, pitcher plants that catch flies, and a few I've crossed myself. It's delicate work, like raising children." She laughed, but it was tight, and Miss Marple caught the glance she threw toward the Deux garden. After breakfast, Clara led Miss Marple to the greenhouse, her steps quick and eager. The others stayed behind, though Miss Marple noticed Sophie watching them through the dining-room window, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. The greenhouse door creaked open, and a wave of warm, earthy air greeted them. Inside, it was like stepping into another world. Rows of plants stretched out under the glass roof, their leaves ranging from velvet green to spiky red. Orchids hung in baskets, their petals delicate as butterfly wings. Carnivorous plants, with their sticky traps and gaping mouths, sat in pots along a wooden bench. Miss Marple's eyes widened, not just at the beauty, but at the sense of something hidden, like a secret whispered in a crowded room. Clara pointed out her favourites: a rare blue orchid, a Venus flytrap that snapped shut when she brushed it, and a strange spiky plant she called a desert star. "This one's from my experiments," she said, her voice proud but guarded. "I'm trying to make new kinds of flowers, ones that can survive anything. My donor's keen on it." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to a corner where a row of metal cabinets stood, each locked with a heavy padlock. A sign read, "Private Research." One lock had a faint scratch, like someone had tried to pick it. She made a mental note, her fingers itching to investigate. As Clara explained her work, Miss Marple wandered the aisles, her sharp eyes catching details. A trowel lay on a bench, its blade caked with fresh soil, though Clara hadn't mentioned digging. A watering can was tipped over, a small puddle spreading beneath it. And under one bench she spotted a patch of dirt that looked freshly turned, as if someone had been digging in a hurry. "Your gardener's been busy," Miss Marple said lightly, pointing to the soil. Clara frowned, her brow creasing. "Tom? He's not supposed to dig there. That's where I keep my experimental seedlings." She knelt to inspect the spot, her fingers brushing the dirt. "Odd," she murmured. "This wasn't like this yesterday." Miss Marple's mind buzzed. The brick last night, the shadow she'd seen, and now this disturbed soil. It all pointed to someone snooping where they shouldn't. She asked Clara about her donor, keeping her tone casual. "Oh, he's a private man," Clara said, standing and dusting her hands. "Mr. Elias Crowther. He sends money through Reginald, but I've never met him. He's keen on my hybrids, says they could change the world." She laughed nervously. "Sounds grand, doesn't it?" Miss Marple smiled, but her thoughts turned to a case years ago, where a generous donor hid a scheme behind polite letters. Money, she knew, often came with strings. They returned to the house for lunch, where the other guests were waiting. Lionel was in the garden now, peering through the greenhouse windows with a frown. Sophie was on the phone in the hall, her voice low and urgent, saying something about needing proof. Reginald sat in the drawing-room, his briefcase open, sorting papers with a tense expression. Miss Marple joined them for sandwiches and lemonade, her knitting basket at her side. She asked Lionel about his work, hoping to draw him out. "Botany's a cutthroat field," he said, pushing his glasses up. "Everyone's chasing the next big discovery. Clara's lucky to have her donor." His tone was sharp, almost jealous, and Miss Marple filed it away. Sophie, meanwhile, was full of questions. "Miss Marple, you've lived here forever," she said, her pen poised. "Ever hear of anything strange at Willow Cottage? Old stories, maybe?" Her eyes were bright, Too bright, like she was hunting for a scoop. Miss Marple smiled vaguely. Oh, villages are full of tales. Most are just gossip. But she thought of the scratched lock and the turned soil, wondering what Sophie might know. Reginald interrupted, his voice dry. Let's not bore Miss Marple with rumours. Clara's work is private. He snapped his briefcase shut, and Miss Marple noticed a letter slip out, its envelope bearing a crest, a rose like the wax seal on Clara's invitation. After lunch, Clara had to run to the village for supplies, leaving Miss Marple with the others. She took the chance to explore the garden again, her shawl wrapped tight against the afternoon chill. The greenhouse pulled her back, its glass walls now cloudy as the sun dipped behind a cloud. She tried the door, unlocked to her surprise. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth and flowers. She moved quietly, her eyes scanning for more clues. The scratched lock on the cabinet gleamed under the light, and she bent closer, wishing she had her hairpin to test it. Instead, she examined the disturbed soil under the bench. It was loose, unlike the packed dirt elsewhere, and a faint mark suggested something had been dragged across it. Kneeling carefully, Miss Marple brushed the soil with her fingers. It was cool and damp, hiding something hard beneath. She didn't dig, not yet, but she suspected a secret lay buried there. Standing, she noticed a small key on the floor, half hidden under a pot. It was too small for the cabinet locks, more like something for a box or a drawer. She slipped it into her pocket, her heart quickening. As she turned to leave, a creak came from the far end of the greenhouse. She froze, her eyes darting to the shadows. A figure stood near the private research area, too quick to identify before it vanished behind a rack of plants. Miss Marple's breath caught, but she kept her composure, stepping outside as if nothing had happened. Back at the house, the guests were scattered. Lionel was in the library, flipping through a book on rare plants, his face tense. Sophie was in the garden, taking photos of the greenhouse from odd angles. Reginald was on the phone, his voice low and clipped, mentioning delays and the client. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles moving steadily. She thought of the key in her pocket, the shadow in the greenhouse, and the crest on Reginald's letter. Each was a thread, and she was beginning to see the pattern. Clara returned as the sun began to set, her arms full of groceries. The village is buzzing about the flower show, she said, setting bags on the counter. They're hoping my orchid wins. Her smile was forced, and Miss Marple wondered what else she'd heard in the village. Over tea, Clara mentioned Tom Biddle, the gardener, would be by later to fix the broken pane. He's a good man, she said, but he's been odd lately, always checking the greenhouse at night. Miss Marple nodded, her mind adding Tom to her list. A gardener with secrets was nothing new in St. Mary Mead. As evening fell, the group gathered for dinner. The mood was heavier now, the broken pane lingering like a ghost. Lionel complained about the village's nosy types, his eyes flicking to Sophie. She laughed it off, but her hand tightened on her fork. Reginald ate in silence, his briefcase never far from his side. Clara tried to keep things light, talking about her plants, but her voice wavered when she mentioned the disturbed soil. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking, her mind weaving. The greenhouse was more than a haven, it was a puzzle, and someone was desperate to solve it. She would watch and wait for the next piece to fall. Chapter 3. A Shadow in the Glass. The evening air at Willow Cottage carried a chill, as if the night itself sensed the unease settling over the house. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking like a quiet metronome. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but her eyes were fixed on the guests around her. Clara Henshaw poured sherry into delicate glasses, her hands steady, but her smile tight, like a thread stretched too thin. Dr. Lionel Vance slouched in an armchair, his glasses fogged from the warmth, muttering about the village's lack of proper security. Sophie Trent, the young journalist, perched on a sofa, her notebook tucked away, but her fingers twitching as if itching to write. Mr. Reginald Poole, the lawyer, stood by the window, his briefcase at his feet, his face as stiff as the starched collar he wore. Dinner had been a quiet affair, with Clara's roast lamb and minted peas overshadowed by the memory of the broken greenhouse pane. The brick, lying in the kitchen like a grim trophy, seemed to loom over their conversation. Clara had brushed it off as a prank, but her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noticed the way her eyes darted to the garden. The others were no better. Lionel's jokes fell flat. Sophie asked too many questions about Clara's work, and Reginald barely spoke, his gaze locked on the darkness outside. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the clues, the scratched lock, the small key in her pocket, the disturbed soil, and the shadows she'd seen in the greenhouse. Something was brewing, and she intended to find out what. As Clara passed around the sherry, the talk turned to the village flower show. "My orchid's nearly ready," Clara said, a spark of pride in her voice. "If it blooms in time, it could win first prize." Lionel snorted, adjusting his glasses. "Orchids are overrated, too fussy. Give me a sturdy rose any day." His tone was sharp, and Miss Marple caught the glance he threw at Clara, as if her success stung him. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Is it true your orchid's worth a fortune? I heard rare plants can sell for thousands." Clara laughed, but it was brittle. "Not everything's about money, Sophie. It's about the science." Reginald cleared his throat, changing the subject to the weather, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on his glass. The clock struck 9, its chime echoing through the room. Miss Marple was about to suggest a game of cards when a sharp, shattering crash cut through the night. It came from the garden, loud and unmistakable, like glass breaking into 1,000 pieces. Clara gasped, her glass slipping to the floor, sherry splashing on the rug. "The greenhouse!" she cried, rushing to the door. The others followed, their chairs scraping against the floor. Miss Marple moved more slowly, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her eyes scanning the group as they spilled into the night. The garden was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds, but the greenhouse glowed faintly, its glass walls reflecting the faint light from the house. As they reached it, Clara let out a small sob. Another pane was shattered, jagged shards glinting on the ground. Inside, a brick lay among the debris, surrounded by scattered soil and a toppled pot. The air smelled of earth and crushed leaves, sharp and bitter. Clara clutched her shawl, her face pale. "Again," she whispered. "Why would anyone do this?" Lionel pushed past her, peering into the greenhouse. "Kids, probably," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sophie was already snapping photos, her camera flashing in the dark. Reginald stood back, his briefcase clutched to his chest, his eyes narrow. Miss Marple knelt by the broken pane, her knees creaking but her mind sharp. The brick was rough, like the one from last night, but this time there was a scrap of paper tied to it with twine. She picked it up carefully, unfolding it to reveal a scrawled note. "Stop your work or worse will come." The handwriting was crude, the ink smudged, as if written in a hurry. She handed it to Clara, who read it and swayed, her hand flying to her mouth. "This is no prank," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone wants to scare me." Miss Marple's eyes swept the scene. The broken pane was low, near the private research area, and the brick had landed near the locked cabinets. She stepped. Inside, her sensible shoes crunching on glass. The soil around the cabinets was disturbed again, with faint scuff marks leading to the door. She bent down, pretending to adjust her shawl, and noticed something odd. The brick's path suggested it had been thrown from inside the greenhouse, not outside. The angle was wrong for an outside toss, and there were no footprints in the soft earth beyond the glass. Her heart quickened, but she kept her face calm, like a pond hiding a current. Lionel was pacing now, his glasses slipping down his nose. "We should call the police," he said, his voice loud. "This is vandalism, plain and simple." Clara shook her head, her eyes fixed on the note. "No police, not yet. It'll only stir up gossip." Sophie tucked her camera away, her expression eager. "This could be a big story," she said, then caught herself adding, "I mean, it's awful, Clara, but people will want to know." Reginald stepped forward, his voice dry. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It could be a misunderstanding." But Miss Marple caught the way his eyes flicked to the cabinets, as if he knew more than he was saying. Back in the house, Clara poured more sherry, her hands shaking. The group sat in the drawing room, the mood heavy. Miss Marple took her usual spot by the fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. She watched the others, her mind piecing together the puzzle. The note was a bold move meant to frighten, but it also revealed something. Someone was desperate to stop Clara's work. The brick thrown from inside suggested the culprit was close, maybe even in this room. She thought of the key in her pocket, the scratched lock, and the shadow she'd seen. Each was a clue, like stitches in a pattern she was beginning to see. "Clara," broke the silence, her voice small, "I don't understand. My work's about plants, not secrets. Why would anyone care?" Lionel leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Maybe it's not about your plants. Maybe it's personal." He glanced at Sophie, who bristled. "Don't look at me," she snapped. "I'm just here to write about the village." Reginald coughed, his fingers tapping his briefcase. "Let's stay calm. No need to accuse anyone." But Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided Clara's eyes. She decided to probe gently, turning to Clara. "Tell me more about your donor, dear. This Mr. Crowther. Does he know about these incidents?" Clara hesitated, twisting her napkin. "I haven't told him. He's particular. He likes results, not problems. Reginald handles all his letters." Miss Marple glanced at Reginald, who shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Crowther values privacy," he said, his voice clipped. "He's a busy man." Miss Marple smiled, her needles. clicking. She remembered a case in St. Mary Mead where a busy man turned out to be a front for something darker. Money, she knew, often hid motives. As the evening wore on, Sophie excused herself, saying she needed to make a call. Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her shawl, followed her to the hall. Through the crack in the door, she heard Sophie's voice, low and urgent. "I'm close," she was saying. "There's something big here. I know it. Just give me time." She hung up, and Miss Marple slipped back to her seat, her mind racing. Sophie was chasing a story, but who was she talking to? And what did she hope to find? The journalist's eagerness was more than curiosity. It was hunger, like a cat stalking a bird. Lionel, meanwhile, was fidgeting, his glasses now smudged from constant adjusting. He muttered about the greenhouse's security, suggesting Clara install locks on every door. "You're too trusting," he told her. His voice edged with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Anger? Or maybe fear? Clara shook her head, her eyes tired. "I just want to grow my plants in peace." Reginald stood, his briefcase in hand. "I'll check the greenhouse before bed," he said. "Make sure it's secure." Miss Marple watched him go, noting the way he clutched his case as if it held more than papers. Alone with Clara, Miss Marple offered a comforting smile. "You've built something special here, my dear. Don't let this trouble you too much." Clara sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I'm trying, Jane. But that note, it's like someone hates what I'm doing." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind turning to the village gossip she'd heard years ago about a botanist whose discovery led to ruin. Secrets, she knew, could grow like weeds, choking out everything else. Upstairs in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle. The greenhouse stood silent in the dark, its broken panes like eyes watching the house. She took out her notebook and added to her list, "Second brick, thrown from inside, note with threat, Sophie's call." Lionel's nerves, Reginald's briefcase. She tapped the page with her pencil, thinking of the key in her pocket. It was too small for the cabinets, but it might fit something else. A box, perhaps, hidden in the greenhouse. She thought of the disturbed soil, the scuff marks, the shadow. Someone was searching for something, and they were getting bold. As she prepared for bed, a faint noise came from the garden, a soft crunch like footsteps on gravel. She peered out, her eyes straining in the moonlight. A figure moved near the greenhouse, too quick to identify, slipping behind a hedge. Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but she stayed calm, her mind sharp as a needle. Tomorrow she would talk to Tom Biddle, the gardener, and see what he knew about the nighttime visitors. For now, she closed her notebook and turned out the light, her thoughts weaving a pattern. The greenhouse was no longer just a haven. It was a trap, and someone was caught in its web. She would find out who, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 4. The Gardener's Tale. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's guest room at Willow Cottage, casting delicate patterns on the floor. She woke with the dawn, her mind already turning over the events of the previous night, the shattered greenhouse pane, the threatening note tied to the brick, and the fleeting figure she'd glimpsed in the garden. Her knitting basket sat on the bedside table next to her notebook, where she jotted down her observations. The small key she'd found in the greenhouse weighed lightly in her pocket, a tiny but nagging clue. Today, she decided she would seek out Tom Biddle, the gardener whose jumpy behaviour Clara had mentioned. Gardeners, in Miss Marple's experience, often saw more than they let on. She dressed in a soft lavender blouse and a tweed skirt, her sensible shoes silent on the polished floor as she headed downstairs. The house was quiet, the air thick with the scent of brewing tea and fresh bread. Clara was in the kitchen, her auburn hair tied back, her hands busy kneading dough. "Morning, Jane," she said, her smile weary but warm. "I'm making rolls for lunch. Did you sleep all right after, last night?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but sharp. "Quite well, dear. I thought I might take a stroll in the garden, perhaps chat with your gardener. He sounds like a dedicated man." Clara's face softened. "Tom's a gem, though he's been odd lately, always checking the greenhouse after dark." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind noting Clara's words. She stepped outside, her shawl draped over her shoulders, the morning air crisp and sweet with the scent of lilacs. The garden was a patchwork of colour, tulips nodding in the breeze, daisies clustered like stars, and a row of lavender buzzing with bees. The greenhouse loomed at the back, its glass walls glinting like a watchful eye. The broken panes from the past 2 nights were patched with boards, giving it a wounded look. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the private research area, where the locked cabinets stood, their scratched locks still a puzzle in her mind. She found Tom Biddle near a rosebush, his weathered hands clipping dead blooms with a pair of shears. He was a wiry man, his face lined like old leather, a faded cap pulled low over his eyes. A limp slowed his movements, one leg dragging slightly as he worked. "Good morning, Mr. Biddle," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. He started, his shears pausing mid-snip. "Morning, ma'am," he mumbled, his eyes flicking to the greenhouse. "You're Mrs. Henshaw's friend, ain't you?" Miss Marple smiled, settling on a nearby bench, her knitting basket at her side. "I am. Such a lovely garden you keep. It must take a steady hand." Tom relaxed a fraction, his shoulders loosening. It's hard work, but I like it. Mrs. Henshaw's particular about her plants." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she started a new row. "I imagine the greenhouse keeps you busy. Clara says you've been checking it at night. Seen anything unusual?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, watching his face. Tom's hands stilled, and he glanced away, his jaw tightening. "Just kids, maybe, throwing bricks and such." But his voice was too quick, and Miss Marple caught the nervous twitch of his fingers. She leaned forward, her smile disarming. "It must be hard, keeping such a special place safe. I heard about the note last night. Quite a nasty thing." Tom's eyes widened, and he rubbed his neck, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Didn't see no note," he said too fast. "But I've seen things, shadows, like, near the cabinets. Didn't tell Mrs. Henshaw. She'd fret." Miss Marple nodded, her needles steady. "Very wise. No need to worry her. But shadows, you say? At night?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "Couple of times. Thought it was my eyes playing tricks, but it moved quick, like someone sneaking." Miss Marple's mind buzzed. A shadow in the greenhouse, just as she'd seen. She thought of the key in her pocket, the scuff marks near the cabinets, the disturbed soil. "You've worked here a long time, haven't you?" she asked, steering the conversation gently. "Must know every corner of that greenhouse." Tom's face clouded, and he shifted his weight, his limp more noticeable. "Aye, near 10 years. Mrs. Henshaw's good to me, even after, well, my troubles." He stopped, his cheeks reddening. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression soft. "Troubles? Oh, we all have them. My nephew once got into a scrape over a bicycle. Silly thing, really." Tom's guard dropped just a bit. "Wasn't no bicycle," he muttered. "Got caught pinching tools from a shop years back. Did time for it. Mrs. Henshaw don't know, and I'd rather she didn't." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind, but her mind filing away the detail. A gardener with a past, nervous about the greenhouse. It was a thread worth pulling. "Your secret's safe with me," she said, her voice warm. "But if you see that shadow again, you'll tell me, won't you?" Tom nodded, his eyes grateful but wary, and went back to his roses. Miss Marple returned to the house, her thoughts spinning. Tom's story confirmed her suspicions. Someone was prowling the greenhouse, and he knew more than he was saying. Inside, the others were gathered in the dining room for lunch. Clara had set out her fresh rolls with cold ham and a salad of greens from the garden. Dr. Lionel Vance was arguing with Sophie Trent about the flower show, his voice sharp. "Clara's orchid won't win," he said, pushing his glasses up. "Too much hype, not enough substance." Sophie smirked, her notebook open. "Hype sells papers, Lionel. People love a mystery." Reginald Poole sat silently, his briefcase on the floor, his eyes fixed on his plate. Miss Marple took her seat, her knitting basket at her feet. She noticed a new tension in the room, like a storm brewing. Clara was quieter than usual, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. "I found something this morning," she said suddenly, her voice low. "My research journal's gone. The one I keep in the greenhouse. It had all my notes on the hybrid." Lionel's fork paused, and Sophie's pen stopped mid-scratch. Reginald looked up, his face blank, but his eyes sharp. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Maybe you misplaced it." Clara shook her head, her lips tight. "I never take it out. Someone's been in there." The room went still. The only sound, the ticking of the clock. Miss Marple sipped her water, her eyes moving from face to face. Lionel's cheeks were flushed, his glasses slipping again. Sophie's expression was too eager, like a fox scenting a trail. Reginald's fingers tapped his briefcase, a nervous rhythm. "Perhaps it fell behind something," Miss Marple said mildly. "Greenhouses are full of nooks." Clara nodded, but her eyes were doubtful. "I'll look again," she said, though her voice lacked hope. After lunch, the group scattered. Lionel headed to the library, muttering about a book he needed. Sophie slipped outside, her camera in hand, saying she wanted photos of the garden. Reginald stayed in the dining room, sorting papers from his briefcase. Miss Marple offered to help Clara clear the table, using the chance to probe. "Your journal sounds important," she said, stacking plates. "Anything valuable in it?" Clara sighed, her hands busy with dishes. "Everything. My notes on the hybrid, the formula I'm working on. Mr. Crowther expects results, and without that journal, I'm lost." Miss Marple nodded, thinking, of the scratched lock and the missing journal. Someone was after Clara's work, and they weren't subtle. As they washed dishes, Miss Marple glanced out the kitchen window. Sophie was near the greenhouse, crouching by the patched panes, her camera aimed at the ground. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Was she looking for clues, or planting them? She thought of Sophie's phone call last night, her talk of being close to something big. A journalist with a nose for secrets could be dangerous, or useful. Miss Marple dried her hands, her mind turning to Reginald's briefcase. That crest on his letter, a rose like Clara's wax seal, nagged at her. She remembered a case in St. Mary Mead, where a lawyer's papers hid a scheme. Could Reginald's briefcase hold the key to this mystery? Later, Miss Marple slipped into the garden, her shawl wrapped tight against the afternoon breeze. The greenhouse drew her like a magnet, its glass walls now cloudy as the sun dipped behind a cloud. She tested the door, locked this time, but the key in her pocket felt warm, as if urging her to try it. She didn't, not yet. Instead, she circled the structure, her eyes scanning for new clues. Near the private research area, she found a fresh scuff mark in the dirt, deeper than the others, as if something heavy had been dragged. She knelt, her fingers brushing the soil, and found a tiny shred of fabric caught on a splintered board. It was grey, like Reginald's suit, but too small to be sure. As she stood, a rustle came from the hedge nearby. She turned, her heart steady but her senses alert. No one was there, but the leaves trembled as if someone had just slipped away. Miss Marple's mind flashed to Tom's shadow, to the figure she'd seen last night. Someone was watching, and they were close. She returned to the house, her steps slow but purposeful. In the drawing room, Lionel was reading, his glasses smudged, his fingers tapping restlessly. Sophie was back, scribbling in her notebook, her camera on the table. Reginald was gone, his briefcase with him. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting, needles moving steadily. She thought of Tom's past, the missing journal, the grey fabric, the scuff mark. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and she was beginning to see its shape. Clara's work was the heart of it, but who wanted it, and why? Lionel's jealousy, Sophie's ambition, Reginald's secrecy, Tom's nerves. They all pointed to the greenhouse. She opened her notebook and added missing journal, grey fabric, deep scuff mark, Tom's secret. The key in her pocket seemed to hum, a reminder of the lock it might fit. Tonight she would watch the greenhouse, and tomorrow she would pull another thread. In St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed buried for long. Chapter 5. A Discovery in the Soil. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, bathing Willow Cottage in a soft golden glow. Miss Jane Marple stood at her guest-room window, her eyes fixed on the greenhouse, its glass walls shimmering like a fragile secret. The events of the past days, the broken panes, the threatening note, the missing journal, and the small key in her pocket, wove a tangled web in her mind. Her knitting basket sat on the dresser, her notebook beside it, filled with careful notes, the scratched lock, the grey fabric, Tom Biddle's nervous confession. Today she decided she would return to the greenhouse and explore that patch of disturbed soil she'd noticed. Something was hidden there, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. Downstairs, the house was quiet, the air scented with fresh coffee and warm muffins. Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, her face pale and drawn. "Morning, Jane," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm trying to keep busy. The village fete's today, and I promised to bring some baked goods." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but her eyes sharp. "A lovely idea, dear. A fete always lifts spirits. Will your guests be going?" Clara sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Lionel and Sophie said they would. Reginald's staying behind, says he has work to do." Miss Marple's mind noted the lawyer's absence. A man with a briefcase full of secrets might prefer solitude. Breakfast was a hurried affair, with Dr. Lionel Vance grumbling about the fate's pointless chatter, and Sophie Trent scribbling in her notebook, her eyes bright with anticipation. Reginald Poole ate silently, his briefcase at his feet, his face as unreadable as ever. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking softly. She asked Clara about the fete, keeping her tone light. "Oh, it's the usual," Clara said. "Stalls, games, and the flower show judging. I'm hoping my orchid makes it through." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple caught the worry in her eyes, thinking of the missing journal and the threat to stop her work. As the others prepared to leave for the fete, Miss Marple excused herself, saying she preferred a quiet morning. In truth, she saw a chance to explore the greenhouse alone. She waited until Clara, Lionel, and Sophie had piled into Tommy's rattling taxi, their voices fading down the lane. Reginald was in the study, his briefcase open, papers spread across the desk. Miss Marple slipped on her shawl, tucked a small trowel from the kitchen into her basket, and headed to the garden. The air was fresh, filled with the hum of bees and the sweet scent of honeysuckle. The greenhouse stood at the back, its patched panes like scars, its glass walls glinting with a quiet menace. The door was unlocked, a careless oversight that made Miss Marple's heart quicken. She stepped inside, the warm, earthy air wrapping around her like a cloak. The plants were a jungle of colour, orchids with delicate petals, pitcher plants with hungry mouths, and the strange desert star Clara had shown her. Her eyes went to the private research area, where the locked cabinets stood, their scratched lock still a mystery. But it was the patch of disturbed soil under a bench that drew her, its surface uneven, as if someone had been digging in haste. She knelt, her knees creaking, and brushed the dirt with her fingers. It was loose, unlike the packed earth nearby, and a faint ridge suggested something buried beneath. Using the trowel, Miss Marple dug carefully, her movements slow to avoid attention. The soil gave way, revealing a small metal box, its surface rusted but intact. Her breath caught as she lifted it, its weight heavier than expected. The lock was small, and she reached for the key in her pocket, her fingers trembling with anticipation. It fit perfectly, clicking open with a soft snap. Inside were papers folded tightly, and a tiny vial of clear liquid labelled Formula X. The papers were in Clara's neat handwriting, filled with cryptic notes about plant hybrids, chemical compounds, and a coded reference to the benefactor. One line stood out: Formula X stable. Crowther must not know. Miss Marple's mind raced. Formula X was no ordinary plant extract. It was the heart of Clara's work, and someone wanted it badly enough to break glass and steal journals. She slipped one page into her pocket, careful to leave the rest undisturbed, and replaced the box in the soil, covering it with care. As she stood, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision near the private research area. She froze, her heart steady, but her senses sharp. The greenhouse was silent, but the air felt heavy, as if someone had just been there. She moved toward the cabinets, her eyes scanning for clues. A faint smudge on the glass door caught her attention. A fingerprint, fresh and clear, as if someone had pressed against it. Before she could investigate further, a voice called out, "Miss Marple?" It was Sophie, standing at the greenhouse door, her camera slung around her neck. "I came back early," she said, her tone too casual. "Thought I'd get some shots of the plants." Her eyes flicked to the bench where Miss Marple had been digging, and Miss Marple smiled, her face serene. "What a lovely idea," she said, stepping away from the cabinets. "Clara's plants are quite special." Sophie nodded, but her gaze lingered on the soil as if she sensed something hidden. Miss Marple's mind noted the journalist's quick return. Was she following a lead, or had she seen something? They walked back to the house together, Sophie chatting about the Fates' crowded stalls, and Lionel's grumbling about the flower show judges. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking as she carried her basket, but her thoughts were on the box and the fingerprint. Inside, Reginald was still in the study, his papers spread out, his face tense. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing at Sophie. "Back already?" he asked, his voice dry. Sophie shrugged, her smile bright. Couldn't miss a chance to explore. Miss Marple noted the lawyer's frown, the way his hand rested on his briefcase, as if guarding it. Over tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to Clara's work, her tone light. "Your plants are remarkable, dear," she said when Clara returned, her arms full of fate ribbons. "That Formula X sounds fascinating. Is it for your orchid?" Clara hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "It's part of my research," she said, glancing at Reginald. "Nothing to talk about yet." Reginald coughed, his fingers tapping his cup. "Best to keep it private," he said. "Mr. Crowther prefers discretion." Sophie leaned forward, her eyes eager. "But it could be a big deal, right? Something worth writing about?" Clara's smile faltered, and Miss Marple saw the fear in her eyes. The afternoon passed with the group scattered. Clara tended to her baking. Lionel retreated to the library, muttering about a rival botanist, and Sophie disappeared to her room, saying she needed to write. Reginald stayed in the study, his briefcase never far. Miss Marple took a walk in the garden, her shawl wrapped tight against the cooling air. She paused by the greenhouse, her eyes on the patched panes. The fingerprint on the glass nagged at her. Whose was it? She thought of Tom Biddle's nervous confession, Lionel's jealousy, Sophie's ambition, and Reginald's secrecy. Each was a thread, and the box in the soil was a knot tying them together. Back in the house, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting steady. She opened her notebook and added metal box with Formula X, Crowther's name in notes, fingerprint on, glass, Sophie's quick return. The key now used was back in her pocket, a reminder of the secrets buried in the greenhouse. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead where a hidden box held stolen jewels, and the thief was the last person anyone suspected. Was Formula X this prize here, Or was it a decoy for something deeper? As evening approached, Clara announced dinner would be simple. Cold meats and salad, as she was tired from the fete. The group gathered in the dining room, the mood heavy. Lionel was quieter now, his glasses smudged, his fingers drumming on the table. Sophie talked too fast, describing the fate's games and the winning roses, but her eyes kept straying to Clara. Reginald ate mechanically, his briefcase at his feet, his face a mask. Miss Marple watched them all, her needles clicking, her mind weaving. The threatening note had warned Clara to stop her work, but the missing journal and the buried box suggested someone wanted her secrets, not her silence. After dinner, Clara excused herself to check the greenhouse, saying she needed to water her plants. Miss Marple offered to join her, sensing a chance to observe. The garden was dark, the greenhouse glowing faintly under the stars. Inside, Clara moved among her plants, her hands gentle, but her face tense. "I can't lose this work, Jane," she said softly, misting an orchid. "It's all I have." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the cabinets. "You've built something special, dear. But secrets can be heavy. Have you told anyone about Formula X?" Clara shook her head, her lips tight. "Only Reginald, and he tells Mr. Crowther. No one else." As they left the greenhouse, Miss Marple glanced back, her eyes catching a faint movement in the shadows. It was gone in an instant, but her heart quickened. Someone was still watching, still searching. Back in her room, she sat by the window, her knitting idle. The greenhouse stood silent, its secrets buried, but not safe. She thought of the fingerprint, the coded notes, Sophie's camera, Reginald's briefcase. Tomorrow she would tug another thread, perhaps starting with the lawyer and his rose-crested letters. In St. Mary Mead, secrets always came to light, and Miss Marple was ready to shine a light on this one. Chapter 6. The Benefactor's Shadow. The morning mist clung to the garden of Willow Cottage, wrapping the greenhouse in a silvery veil. Miss Jane Marple stood at her guest-room window, her sharp eyes tracing the glass structure's outline, its patched panes like stitches on a wound. The events of the past days, the broken glass, the threatening note, the missing journal, the buried box with its cryptic notes about Formula X, wove a complex pattern in her mind. Her knitting basket rested on the dresser next to her notebook, where she'd added last night's observations. The fingerprint on the glass, Sophie's suspicious return, the coded reference to Mr. Crowther. Today, she resolved to learn more about Clara's mysterious benefactor, whose shadow seemed to loom over the greenhouse's secrets. She slipped the small key into her pocket, its weight a quiet reminder of the lock it had opened. Downstairs, the house was stirring, the air filled with the comforting aroma of frying bacon and fresh toast. Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, her hands busy at the stove, but her face was drawn, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Morning, Jane," she said, managing a faint smile. "I hope you're not tired of my cooking yet." Miss Marple settled at the table, her expression warm but watchful. "Not at all, dear. Your meals are a treat. Any news from the village?" Clara shook her head, flipping a piece of bacon. "Just more talk about the fete. And my orchid, it's still in the running for the flower show." Her voice held a spark of hope, but it flickered like a candle in a draught. the other guests trickled in for breakfast. Dr. Lionel Vance slumped into a chair, his bald head gleaming, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. He muttered about the damp weather, his mood as sour as the grapefruit on his plate. Sophie Trent breezed in, her short brown hair tousled, her notebook tucked under her arm. She chatted brightly about the Fates cake stall, but her eyes darted to Clara as if gauging her mood. Mr. Reginald Poole arrived last, his grey suit immaculate, his briefcase clutched like a lifeline. Miss Marple noted the way he avoided Clara's gaze, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the table. Over breakfast, the conversation was stilted, the memory of the threatening note hanging over them like a storm cloud. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She steered the talk toward Clara's work, her tone gentle. "Your research sounds so fascinating, dear," she said. "This Mr. Crowther must be quite a supporter to fund it all." Clara hesitated, her fork pausing. "He is," she said carefully. "He believes in my hybrids, says they could change things, but he's private. I only deal with him through Reginald." She glanced at the lawyer, who cleared his throat, his face stiff. "Mr. Crowther values discretion," Reginald said, his voice dry as old paper. "He's a busy man, not one for small talk." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp. "Of course, a generous man, though, to invest in plants." She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a generous donor hid a smuggling ring behind charitable gifts. Money, she knew, often masked darker motives. Lionel snorted, pushing his glasses up. "Money's wasted on fussy orchids. Practical plants are what matter." His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple caught the jealous glint in his eyes, as if Clara's success grated on him. After breakfast, Clara announced she needed to check the greenhouse, her voice tight with worry about her orchid. Lionel and Sophie decided to join her, while Reginald stayed behind, citing paperwork. Miss Marple offered to help with the dishes, using the chance to probe Clara further. As they scrubbed plates, she asked, "Does Mr. Crowther ever visit, dear, or send anyone to check on your work?" Clara shook her head, her hands busy in the soapy water. "Never. It's all letters through Reginald. He's strict about results, though. If I don't deliver, he might pull the funding." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the note in the buried box. Crowther must not know. Why the secrecy? With the dishes done, Miss Marple slipped into the garden, her shawl wrapped against the morning chill. The greenhouse drew her, its glass, walls misty with condensation. She tested the door, locked now, but she had the key. She decided to wait, not wanting to risk being caught. Instead, she wandered the garden paths, her eyes scanning for clues. Near the greenhouse, she found a fresh footprint in the soft earth, small and narrow, unlike Tom Biddle's heavy boots. It was near the patched panes, where the threatening note had been thrown. She knelt, examining the print, its edges crisp, suggesting it was recent. Her mind spun. Whose foot was this? Sophie's, perhaps, given her sneaky return yesterday, or someone else entirely. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and noticed a faint trail of bent grass leading to a side path. It was subtle, but Miss Marple's eyes missed nothing. The trail stopped at a low hedge, where a single leaf was caught on a twig, its edge torn as if snagged in a hurry. She tucked the leaf into her pocket next to the key, her heart quickening. Someone had been here, moving parallel to her own investigation, their actions hidden but not invisible. She thought of Tom Biddle's talk of shadows, the fingerprint on the glass, the buried box. The greenhouse was a maze of secrets, and she was threading her way through it. Back at the house, the others returned from the greenhouse, their faces tense. Clara's hands trembled as she set down her watering can. "It's awful, Jane," she said, her voice breaking. "My prize orchid, it's been poisoned. The petals are black, shriveled like burnt paper." Miss Marple's breath caught, her mind racing. Poison was no accident. It was sabotage, a bold move to cripple Clara's work. Lionel paced, his glasses slipping, his voice loud. "It's those village brats, I bet. Throwing bricks wasn't enough, so they've gone for the plants." But his eyes flicked to the floor, avoiding Clara's gaze, and Miss Marple noted the mud on his shoes. Fresh, but the greenhouse paths were clean gravel. Sophie was scribbling in her notebook, her pen moving fast. "This is big," she muttered, then caught herself, adding, "It's terrible, Clara. I'm so sorry." Her tone was sincere, but her eyes gleamed with the hunger of a story. Reginald stood by the door, his briefcase clutched tight, his face blank, but his knuckles white. "We should report this," he said, his voice flat. "It's vandalism." Clara shook her head, tears welling. "No police. It'll only make things worse." Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression soft, but her mind sharp. Poisoned plants, a threatening note, a missing journal. These were not random acts, but a deliberate campaign. Miss Marple suggested they sit for tea, hoping to calm Clara and observe the others. In the drawing room, she took her usual spot by the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily. She asked Clara about the poison, keeping her tone gentle. "It's strange," Clara said, her voice small. "The orchid was fine yesterday. Someone got in, used something strong, maybe a chemical from my own supplies." Miss Marple nodded, thinking of the vial in the buried box labelled Formula X. Could it be the poison, or was it the prize someone was after? She glanced at Lionel, whose muddy shoes stood out against his tidy appearance. "You were in the greenhouse this morning, Dr. Vance," she said lightly. "Did you notice anything odd?" Lionel's face reddened, his glasses slipping again. "Just checking the plants, like Clara asked. Nothing unusual." But his voice was too quick, and Miss Marple's mind filed away his discomfort. Sophie, meanwhile, was asking Clara about the orchid's value, her questions sharp. Was it insured? Could someone profit from this? Clara's eyes widened, her hands twisting her napkin. "It's not about money. It's my work, my dream." Reginald coughed, his fingers tapping his briefcase. "Let's not speculate. It's a loss, but we'll move on." His tone was calm, but Miss Marple caught the tension in his jaw as if he knew more than he let on. She decided to probe further, turning to Reginald. "Mr. Crowther must be disappointed," she said, her voice mild. "Such a setback for his investment." Reginald's eyes narrowed, his fingers stilling. He'll understand. Accidents happen. But his tone was clipped, and Miss Marple remembered the rose-crested letter in his briefcase, its seal matching Clara's invitation. Was Crowther more than a distant funder? She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a hidden benefactor pulled strings from afar, orchestrating trouble to control the outcome. Were Crowther's letters a parallel to that scheme? As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple took another walk in the garden, her shawl wrapped tight against the breeze. The greenhouse stood silent, its broken panes patched, its interior a graveyard of Clara's hopes. She circled it, her eyes catching a new clue, a discarded glove, half buried in the dirt near the footprint she'd found. It was leather, worn but fine, not a gardener's glove. She tucked it into her pocket, her mind racing. The glove, the footprint, the torn leaf. Someone was moving parallel to her, their actions careful, but not careful enough. She tested the greenhouse door again, still locked. The key in her pocket felt heavier now, a link to the buried box and its secrets. Back inside, the mood was sombre. Clara was in the kitchen, staring at a tray of scones, as if they could fix her broken dreams. Lionel was in the library, flipping through a book on plant toxins, his face tense. Sophie was on her phone in the hall, her voice low, saying, "It's bigger than I thought. Someone's playing dirty." Miss Marple lingered nearby, her ears catching every word. Sophie's ambition was clear, but was she a hunter or a pawn? Reginald was in the study, his briefcase open, a letter with the rose crest visible among his papers. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Crowther's influence was everywhere, a shadow moving parallel to the chaos. Dinner was quiet, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Clara served soup and bread, her hands shaking as she ladled. Lionel ate quickly, his glasses fogged from the steam. Sophie asked about the orchid's recovery, her pen ready, her eyes too eager. Reginald spoke little, his briefcase at his side, his face a mask. Miss Marple watched them all, her needles clicking, her mind weaving. The poisoned orchid was a warning, like the note, but it also pointed to someone close, someone with access to the greenhouse. She thought of the glove, the footprint, Sophie's call, Lionel's muddy shoes, Reginald's letters. Each was a thread, and the benefactor's shadow was growing darker. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting idle. The greenhouse glowed faintly under the stars, its secrets locked tight, but not safe. She opened her notebook and added, poisoned orchid, small footprint, leather glove, Sophie's call, Lionel's shoes, Crowther's crest. The key in her pocket seemed to pulse, a reminder of Formula X and its hidden purpose. Tomorrow she would tug another thread, perhaps starting with Sophie and her mysterious contact. In St. Mary Mead, secrets always surfaced, and Miss Marple was ready to pull them into the light, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 7. A Journalist's Ambition. The morning sun broke through the mist at Willow Cottage, casting a warm glow over the garden. But the greenhouse stood like a silent sentinel, its patched panes glinting with secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her sharp eyes fixed on the glass structure, its wounded appearance a reminder of the chaos unfolding. Her knitting basket rested on the bedside table next to her notebook, filled with careful observations. The buried box with Formula X, the poisoned orchid, the leather glove, the small footprint. The key in her pocket felt like a quiet ally, its purpose fulfilled, but its meaning still unclear. Today she decided to focus on Sophie Trent, the young journalist whose eager questions and sneaky phone calls hinted at a deeper agenda. In Miss Marple's experience, ambition could be as dangerous as greed, and Sophie's hunger for a story was a thread worth pulling. Downstairs, the house was alive with the scent of fresh coffee and warm porridge. Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, her hands stirring a pot, her face pale and tired. "Morning, Jane," she said, her voice soft but strained. "I'm trying to keep things normal." But after the orchid, she trailed off, her eyes flicking, to the garden. Miss Marple settled at the table, her expression kind but watchful. "You're doing wonderfully, dear. A good breakfast sets the day right. Will Sophie be joining us?" Clara nodded, spooning porridge into bowls. "She's always up early, scribbling in that notebook. Says she's writing about the village, but I wonder—" The other guests drifted in, their moods as varied as the morning light. Dr. Lionel Vance slouched into a chair, his glasses smudged, his bald head catching the sun. He grumbled about the village's nosy types, his voice sharp with irritation. Sophie breezed in, her short brown hair tucked behind her ears, her notebook clutched like a treasure. She smiled brightly, but her eyes were restless, darting to Clara and the window. Mr. Reginald Poole arrived last, his grey suit crisp, his briefcase at his side, his face as closed as a locked door. Miss Marple noted the tension in the room, like a storm brewing beneath the polite chatter. Breakfast was simple but hearty, with Clara's porridge and a tray of scones. The conversation danced around safe topics: the weather, the village shop, the upcoming flower show judging. But the poisoned orchid loomed like a ghost. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking softly, and steered the talk towards Sophie's work. "Your article must be coming along nicely," she said, her tone gentle. "What's it about, dear? Village life, or something more? Exciting?" Sophie's pen paused, her smile tightening. "Oh, just the usual. Fates, flowers, local characters. But I'm always looking for a good story." Her eyes flicked to Clara, and Miss Marple caught the hunger in them, like a cat spotting a bird. Lionel snorted, pushing his glasses up. "Stories cause trouble. Stick to facts, not gossip." Sophie laughed, but it was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on her notebook. Reginald cleared his throat, his voice dry. "Let's not stir things up. Clara's had enough trouble." He glanced at his briefcase, as if it held the answer to the chaos. Miss Marple smiled, her mind turning to the rose-crested letter she'd seen in his papers, its seal matching Clara's invitation. Was Sophie chasing the same secret, or was her ambition leading her elsewhere? After breakfast, Clara announced she needed to run to the village for supplies, and Lionel offered to go with her, saying he needed fresh air. Reginald stayed behind, citing a need to review documents. Sophie lingered, her camera in hand, saying she wanted to photograph the garden. Miss Marple saw her chance. "I could use a walk, dear," she said to Sophie, her voice warm. "Mind if I join you? I'd love to hear more about your work." Sophie hesitated, then nodded, her smile polite but wary. They stepped into the garden, the air fresh with the scent of roses and damp earth. The garden was a patchwork of colour, with tulips swaying and bees humming over lavender. The greenhouse loomed at the back, its glass walls misty, its patched panes a stark reminder of the trouble. As they walked, Miss Marple kept her pace slow, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting basket swinging gently. "You must meet all sorts of people in your work," she said, her tone light. "Anyone interesting in St. Mary Mead?" Sophie shrugged, her camera clicking as she snapped a photo of a rosebush. "Just the usual villagers. But Clara's greenhouse, it's special. People talk about her work, you know. Rumours of something big." Miss Marple's ears pricked up, but she kept her face serene. "Rumours, dear? What sort?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers adjusting the camera lens. "Oh, just talk. Some say she's got a plant that could make medicine, or maybe money. Heard about Formula X. Sounds like a scoop." Her voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching Miss Marple for a reaction. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking as she pulled a ball of yarn from her basket. "Village gossip is often just air, but you seem keen to find the truth." Sophie nodded, her smile tight. "A good story needs proof. I've got a source, someone who knows things. They say Clara's hiding something." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her tone mild. "A source? How exciting! Someone local." Sophie's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, snapping another photo. "Not exactly. They contacted me, said they had proof about Clara's work. I just need to find it." Miss Marple nodded, thinking of Sophie's phone call, her talk of being close to something big. Was her source the same person breaking pains and poisoning plants? She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead where a journalist's tip led to, a blackmail scheme. Ambition, she knew, could blind even the sharpest eyes. They paused by the greenhouse, its glass walls reflecting the morning light. Sophie peered inside, her camera aimed at the private research area. "Clara's so secretive about those cabinets," she said, her voice low. "What's she hiding?" Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the scratched lock, the faint smudge of the fingerprint she'd seen yesterday. "Some things are private for a reason," she said gently, "but curiosity is a powerful thing." Sophie nodded, her eyes narrowing, and Miss Marple wondered if she'd been the one snooping, leaving footprints and torn leaves. As they returned to the house, a cry rang out from the garden. It was Clara, running from the greenhouse, her face white as chalk. "Jane! Sophie! Come quick!" They hurried over, Miss Marple's step steady despite her age. Inside the greenhouse, Clara stood by a bench, her hands shaking. A tray of seedlings, tiny, delicate plants she'd been nurturing, lay smashed, their roots exposed, their leaves crushed. "They're ruined," Clara whispered, tears in her eyes. "Someone did this on purpose." The air smelled of broken stems and damp soil, a bitter tang that matched the mood. Miss Marple knelt, her eyes scanning the scene. The tray was overturned, but the damage was precise, as if someone had targeted these plants alone. A faint smear of green sap stained the bench, and a single petal, bright red, lay nearby, unlike any plant in the greenhouse. She tucked the petal into her pocket, next to the key and the leaf, her mind racing. This was no random act. It was a message, like the poisoned orchid, meant to hurt Clara's work. Sophie was already snapping photos, her camera clicking furiously. "This is awful," she said, but her voice held a trace of excitement, as if the destruction was fuel for her story. Lionel appeared at the door, his glasses fogged, his face flushed from the walk back. "What's happened now?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Clara explained, her voice breaking, and Lionel shook his head. "You need better locks, Clara. This place is too open." But Miss Marple noted his hands, smudged with dirt, though he'd been in the village. Reginald joined them, his briefcase in hand, his face grim. "Another attack," he said, his tone flat. "You should reconsider the police." Clara shook her head, her hands twisting her apron. "No, I can't let this get out. It'll ruin everything." Miss Marple suggested they return to the house, sensing Clara needed a moment to compose herself. In the drawing-room, she took her usual spot by the fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. She watched the group, her mind weaving. The smashed seedlings were a step beyond the poisoned orchid, a personal blow to Clara's hopes. She thought of the red petal, the green sap, Lionel's dirty hands, Sophie's eager photos. Each was a clue, pointing to someone close, someone with access. She decided to probe Sophie further, using her disarming charm. "Your source must be thrilled with all this drama," she said lightly, her eyes on the journalist. "It's quite a story." Sophie's pen paused, her cheeks reddening. "I haven't told them yet," she said too quickly. "But they'll want to know. They said Clara's work could change everything. Medicine, maybe, or something bigger." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Change can be dangerous," she said. "Some people want to control it." She thought of the buried box. The note warning Crowther must not know. Was Sophie's source tied to the benefactor, or working against him? She remembered a case where a tipster led a reporter into danger, their promises as empty as a dry well. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple slipped into the garden alone, her shawl wrapped tight. The greenhouse stood quiet, its broken seedlings a silent accusation. She examined the bench again, finding a tiny shard of glass near the smashed tray, its edge sharp and clean as if recently broken. It didn't match the patched panes, perhaps from a vial, like the one in the buried box. She tucked it into her pocket, her heart quickening. The red petal, the glass shard, the green sap. They were pieces of a puzzle, and someone was playing a dangerous game. Back inside, Clara was in the kitchen, staring at a kettle as if it held answers. Lionel was in the library, his nose in a book on plant chemistry, his fingers still smudged. Sophie was on her phone in the hall, her voice low, saying, "It's getting worse. I need more time." Reginald was in the study, his briefcase open, the rose-crested letter visible again. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting steady, her mind racing. She opened her notebook and added smashed seedlings, red petal, glass shard, green sap, Sophie's source. The key in her pocket felt heavier, a link to Formula X and its hidden purpose. Dinner was a tense affair, with Clara serving stew and bread, her hands unsteady. Lionel complained about the village's lack of security, his voice edged with nerves. Sophie asked about the seedlings, her pen ready, her eyes too bright. Reginald ate in silence, his briefcase at his feet, his face a mask. Miss Marple watched them all, her needles clicking, her thoughts weaving. The greenhouse was a battleground, and Sophie's ambition was a spark that could ignite it. Tomorrow she would tug another thread, perhaps starting with the rose-crested Letter and Reginald's Secrets. In St. Mary Mead, ambition often led to truth, and Miss Marple was ready to follow it. Chapter 8. The Lawyer's Secret. The morning light crept over St. Mary Mead, painting the garden of Willow Cottage in soft hues of pink and gold. Miss Jane Marple stood at her guest-room window, her sharp eyes fixed on the greenhouse, its glass, walls glinting like a puzzle waiting to be solved. The past days had woven a tangled web of clues. The broken panes, the threatening note, the poisoned orchid, the smashed seedlings, the buried box with Formula X, and the small key now tucked in her pocket. Her notebook, resting beside her knitting basket, held her latest observations: the red petal, the glass shard, Sophie's mysterious source, and the rose-crested letter in Reginald Poole's briefcase. Today, she decided to focus on the lawyer, whose guarded demeanour and constant grip on his briefcase hinted at secrets tied to Clara's benefactor. In Miss Marple's experience, men like Reginald hid more than paperwork, and she intended to tug that thread. Downstairs, the house was quiet, the air filled with the warm scent of baking bread and brewing tea. Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, her hands kneading dough, her face etched with worry. "Morning, Jane," she said, her voice soft but strained, like a flower bending under frost. "I'm trying to keep busy, but the greenhouse, it's breaking my heart." Miss Marple settled at the table, her expression kind, but her eyes sharp. "You're doing wonderfully, dear. A good loaf can mend a lot. Will Mr. Poole be joining us?" Clara shook her head, slicing dough with a quick hand. "He's in the study, always with that briefcase. Says he's working, but he's been so quiet." The other guests drifted in for breakfast, their moods heavy as the morning mist. Dr. Lionel Vance slouched into a chair, his glasses smudged, his bald head catching the light. He muttered about the village's meddling fools, his voice sharp with frustration. Sophie Trent bounced in, her notebook under her arm, her eyes bright but restless, like a hunter scenting a trail. Mr. Reginald Poole arrived last, his grey suit crisp, his briefcase clutched like a shield. Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on its handle, as if it held his very life. Breakfast was simple. Clara's fresh bread with butter and jam, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. The smashed seedlings and poisoned orchid lingering like ghosts. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking softly, and steered the conversation toward Reginald. "You must be busy, Mr. Poole, handling Mrs. Henshaw's affairs," she said, her tone gentle. "This Mr. Crowther sounds like an important client." Reginald's eyes flicked up, his face stiff. "He's private," he said, his voice dry as old leaves. "Prefers to keep things quiet." Clara nodded, spreading jam on her bread. "He's been good to me, funding my work, but I only know him through Reginald's letters." Miss Marple smiled, her mind flashing to the rose-crested letter she'd glimpsed. "Such a generous man," she said. "Does he ever ask about your progress?" Reginald's fingers paused on his teacup, his knuckles whitening. "He trusts me to handle it," he said too quickly. Lionel snorted, pushing his glasses up. "Trust's a funny thing in science. Everyone's after the big prize." His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple caught the jealous glint in his eyes, as if Clara's success stung him. Sophie leaned forward, her pen scratching in her notebook. A prize like Formula X? She asked, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. Clara's face paled, and Reginald's jaw tightened. "Let's not speculate," he said, his tone clipped. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind noting the lawyer's discomfort, Sophie's probing, and Lionel's envy. After breakfast, Clara announced she needed to tend the greenhouse, her voice heavy with dread. Lionel and Sophie offered to help, while Reginald stayed behind, citing a need to finish his work. Miss Marple saw her chance. "I'll keep you company, Mr. Poole," she said, her voice warm. "I could use a quiet morning." Reginald hesitated, then nodded, his face unreadable. They moved to the study, where his briefcase sat open, papers neatly stacked, but the rose-crested letter tucked just out of sight. Miss Marple settled in an armchair, her knitting basket at her side, her eyes missing nothing. She began with small talk, asking about the village and Reginald's work in London. His answers were short, his tone guarded, but Miss Marple's gentle persistence softened his edges. "You must see all sorts of clients," she said, her needles clicking. "Men, like Mr. Crowther, with big ideas." Reginald's fingers twitched, his eyes on his papers. "He's unique," he said, "likes things done his way." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling a case where a lawyer's loyalty hid a darker allegiance. "I suppose you handle his letters," she said lightly. "I saw one with a lovely crest. A rose, wasn't it?" Reginald's head snapped up, his face paling. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice sharp. But Miss Marple saw the letter's edge peeking from his briefcase, its seal unmistakable. Before she could press further, a shout echoed from the garden. "Clara! Jane!" It was Sophie, her voice high with panic. Miss Marple and Reginald hurried outside where Clara stood by the greenhouse, her hands covering her mouth. Lionel was beside her, his glasses fogged, his face flushed. The door was ajar, and inside a shelf of rare plants lay toppled, their pots shattered, their leaves crushed into the dirt. A strange smell hung in the air, sharp and chemical, like spilled medicine. Clara's eyes were wet, her voice trembling. "It's worse every time," she said. "Someone wants to ruin me." Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the scene. The shelf was heavy, not easily knocked over, and the damage was precise, targeting Clara's most delicate hybrids. A trail of green liquid dripped from a broken vial, its label smudged but readable. Test Sample 3. It wasn't Formula X, but it was close, part of Clara's experiments. A scrap of paper lay among the debris, torn and crumpled, with a single word scrawled in hasty ink. "Leave." Miss Marple tucked the paper into her pocket, next to the key, the leaf, the petal, and the glass shard, her heart racing. This was no vandalism. It was a calculated strike, parallel to the earlier attacks, but bolder. Lionel paced, his hands smudged with dirt, his voice loud. "This is madness. Clara, you need to lock this place up tight." But Miss Marple noted his shoes again, caked with fresh soil, though the greenhouse paths were clean. Sophie was snapping photos, her camera clicking, her face a mix of shock and excitement. "This is a story now," she muttered, then caught herself, adding, "I mean, it's awful, Clara." Reginald stood by the door, his briefcase clutched, his eyes narrow. "We can't keep ignoring this," he said, It's sabotage." Clara shook her head, her hands twisting her apron. "No police. I can't let Mr. Crowther hear about this. He'll pull my funding." Miss Marple suggested they return to the house, sensing Clara's distress. In the drawing room, she took her usual spot by the fire, her knitting needles moving steadily. She watched the group, her mind weaving. The toppled shelf, the green liquid, the torn note, they were deliberate, meant to scare Clara into stopping her work. But why? She thought of the buried box. The note warning Crowther must not know. Was Reginald protecting his client, or hiding something worse? She decided to probe him further, using her disarming charm. "Mr. Poole, you must be worried for Clara," she said, her voice soft. "All this trouble, and Mr. Crowther so far away." Reginald's fingers tightened on his briefcase, his face stiff. "I'll handle it," he said. "Crowther doesn't need to know every detail." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching the rose crest peeking from his papers. "Of course," she said, "but letters can reveal so much. That crest is quite distinctive." Reginald's eyes widened, his hand moving to cover the letter. "It's nothing," he said, his voice sharp. But Miss Marple's mind was racing. She knew that crest from a case years ago, tied to a businessman with a knack for bending the law. Was Crowther that man, or his pawn? As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple slipped into the garden alone, her shawl wrapped tight against the breeze. The greenhouse stood silent, its broken plants a testament to someone's desperation. She examined the toppled shelf, finding a faint scratch on its edge, as if a tool had been used to pry it loose. Near the broken vial, she spotted a tiny button, grey and polished, matching Reginald's suit. She tucked it into her pocket, her heart quickening. The button, the scratch, the green liquid, they were pieces of a puzzle, and someone was moving fast to cover their tracks. Back inside, Clara was in the kitchen, staring at a kettle, her hands shaking. Lionel was in the library, his nose in a book on chemical compounds, his fingers still dirty. Sophie was on her phone in the hall, her voice low, saying, "It's escalating. I need more proof." Miss Marple lingered nearby, her ears catching every word. Sophie's ambition was afire, but was she fanning the flames or caught in them? Reginald was in the study, his briefcase open, the rose-crested letter now hidden. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting steady, her mind weaving. She opened her notebook and added, "Toppled shelf, green liquid, torn note, leave, grey button." Reginald's crest. The key in her pocket felt heavier, a link to Formula X and its hidden purpose. Dinner was a tense affair, with Clara serving soup and rolls, her hands unsteady. Lionel complained about the village's lack of order, his voice edged with nerves. Sophie asked about the damaged plants, her pen ready, her eyes too bright. Reginald ate in silence, his briefcase at his feet, his face a mask. Miss Marple watched them all, her needles clicking, her thoughts racing. The greenhouse was a battlefield, and Reginald's secrecy was a wall she needed to breach. Later, as the house settled, she overheard a heated exchange outside the study. It was Reginald and Lionel, their voices low but sharp. "You're meddling with the formula," Reginald hissed. "You'll ruin everything." Lionel's reply was too quiet to catch, but Miss Marple's heart quickened. Were they in this together, or at odds? As night fell, Miss Marple sat by, her window, her knitting idle. The greenhouse glowed faintly under the stars, its secrets locked tight but not safe. She thought of the button, the rose crest, the torn note, Lionel's words. Tomorrow she would tug another thread, perhaps confronting Reginald about his letters. In St. Mary Mead, secrets always surfaced, and Miss Marple was ready to pull them into the light, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 9. The Greenhouse Trap. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead, casting a gentle glow across the garden of Willow Cottage. Miss Jane Marple stood at her guest-room window, her sharp eyes fixed on the greenhouse, its glass walls shimmering with secrets. The past days had woven an intricate web of clues: the broken panes, the threatening note, the poisoned orchid, the smashed seedlings, the buried box with Formula X, the grey button, and the rose-crested letter in Reginald Poole's briefcase. Her knitting basket sat on the dresser, next to her notebook, filled with careful observations. The red petal, the glass shard, Sophie's mysterious source, Lionel's muddy shoes. The key in her pocket, now used to unlock the buried box, felt like a quiet partner in her quest. Today, Miss Marple decided to set a trap to catch the culprit haunting Clara's greenhouse. In her experience, a bold move could unravel even the tightest knots. Downstairs, the house was stirring, the air warm with the scent of fresh muffins and brewing tea. Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, her hands busy arranging a tray, but her face was pale, her eyes heavy with worry. "Morning, Jane," she said, her voice soft but trembling, like a leaf in a storm. "I'm trying to keep things normal, but the greenhouse? It's like a curse." Miss Marple settled at the table, her expression kind but her eyes sharp. "You're doing wonderfully, dear. A good breakfast can lift the spirits. Are the others up?" Clara nodded, setting out muffins. "Lionel's grumpy as ever, Sophie's scribbling, and Reginald's in the study with that briefcase." Other guests drifted in, their moods as heavy as the morning mist. Dr. Lionel Vance slumped into a chair, his glasses smudged, his bald head catching the light. He muttered about the village's endless gossip, his voice sharp with irritation. Sophie Trent bounced in, her notebook clutched tight, her eyes bright but restless, like a fox on the hunt. Mr. Reginald Poole arrived last, his grey suit crisp, his briefcase at his side, his face as closed as a locked gate. Miss Marple noted the tension in the room, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Breakfast was simple, muffins, jam and tea, but the air was thick with unspoken fears. The smashed seedlings and poisoned orchid lingered like shadows, and the latest attack on the greenhouse shelf had left Clara shaken. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking softly, and decided to plant the seed of her trap. "Clara, dear," she said, her tone gentle, "your work is so remarkable. Have you made any breakthroughs lately? Something worth sharing?" Clara's eyes widened, her hands pausing on her teacup. "Well, maybe," she said, her voice hesitant. "I think I've cracked Formula X. It's stable now, ready to show the world." The room went still, the only sound the clink of a spoon against a saucer. Lionel's glasses slipped, his face flushing. "Stable?" he said, his voice sharp. "That's unexpected." Sophie's pen scratched furiously, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "That's huge, Clara! A real scoop!" Reginald's fingers tightened on his briefcase, his face stiff. "You should be careful," he said, his voice low. "Crowther won't like surprises." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking, her mind noting their reactions. The trap was set. She'd announced a breakthrough, and the culprit would surely act tonight, desperate to steal or destroy Formula X. After breakfast, Clara headed to the village to deliver muffins for the church sale, taking Lionel and Sophie with her. Reginald stayed behind, citing paperwork. Miss Marple saw her chance to plan. She enlisted Tom Biddle, the gardener, whose nervous confession about his past had earned her trust. She found him by the rose bushes, his weathered hands clipping stems, his limp slowing his steps. "Mr. Biddle," she said, her voice warm, "I need your help tonight. Someone's been troubling Mrs. Henshaw's greenhouse, and I think they'll try again." Tom's eyes widened, his cap tilting as he rubbed his neck. "I knew it," he muttered. "Seen shadows, like I told you. What's the plan, ma'am?" Miss Marple explained, her voice low. She'd placed a decoy vial in the greenhouse, labelled Formula X, filled with harmless plant food. She and Tom would hide nearby at midnight, watching for the culprit. "You're a good man, Tom," she said, patting his arm. "Mrs. Henshaw's lucky to have you." Tom's cheeks reddened, but his eyes were firm. "I'll do it. She's been kind to me," Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting his loyalty, though she still wondered about his nighttime checks of the greenhouse. The day passed quietly, the house filled with the hum of village life. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in the garden, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes scanning for clues. Near the greenhouse, she found a fresh mark in the dirt, a faint scrape like a tool dragged in haste. It was near the spot where she'd found the grey button, suggesting someone had returned. She tucked a small pebble from the scrape into her pocket. Next to the key, the leaf, the petal, the glass shard, and the torn note. The greenhouse was a web, and someone was caught in it, their movements growing reckless. Back inside, Clara returned with tales of the church sale, her voice lighter, but her eyes still worried. Lionel was in the library, flipping through a book on plant diseases, his fingers smudged with ink. Sophie was in her room, typing on a small typewriter, her door ajar, revealing a pile of notes. Reginald was in the study, his briefcase open, the rose-crested letter tucked among his papers. Miss Marple lingered nearby, her ears catching a snippet of his phone call. "It's under control, but she's getting close." Her heart quickened. Reginald was hiding something, and the crest tied him to Crowther's shadow. As evening fell, Miss Marple gathered the group in the drawing-room, her trap ready to spring. "Clara, dear," she said, her voice clear, "why don't you share your good news? It might lift our spirits." Clara hesitated, then nodded, playing along. "I've done it," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Formula X is ready. I'll show it to everyone tomorrow." Lionel's glasses slipped, his face pale. "Tomorrow?" he said, his voice hoarse. Sophie's pen stopped, her eyes wide. "That's incredible, Clara. Can I see it now?" Reginald's hand froze on his briefcase, his jaw tight. "Be careful," he said. "Such news could attract trouble." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking, her mind noting their reactions. The bait was set. Dinner was tense, with Clara serving roast chicken and potatoes, Her hands unsteady, Lionel ate quickly, his glasses fogged, his voice sharp as he complained about the village's prying eyes. Sophie asked about Formula X, her pen ready, her eyes too eager. Reginald spoke little, his briefcase at his feet, his face a mask. Miss Marple watched them all, her thoughts racing. The decoy vial was in place, hidden in the private research area, and Tom was ready to watch. Tonight, someone would make a move, and she would be there to catch them. After dinner, the house settled into quiet. Miss Marple slipped into the garden, her shawl wrapped tight against the night chill. She met Tom by the hedge, his face half hidden in the shadows, his limp barely noticeable in his careful steps. They crouched behind a row of lavender, their eyes on the greenhouse. The moon cast a pale light, making the glass walls glow like a lantern. At midnight, a figure appeared, moving silently toward the greenhouse door. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she recognized Lionel, his bald head gleaming, a flashlight in his hand. He slipped inside, his movements quick and practiced. Miss Marple and Tom crept closer, staying low. Through the glass, she saw Lionel approach the private research area, his flashlight sweeping over the cabinets. He pried at a lock, his hands shaking, then found the decoy vial on a bench, its label glinting. He grabbed it, his face lit with triumph. But before he could move, Sophie emerged from the shadows, her voice sharp. "Give it to me, Lionel," she hissed. "I know what it's worth." Lionel spun, his glasses slipping, his voice low but angry. "You're in over your head, girl. This isn't your story." A scuffle broke out, their shadows dancing on the glass. Sophie lunged for the vial, and Lionel pushed her back, the vial slipping to the floor. Before it could break, Reginald appeared, his briefcase in one hand, a letter in the other, its rose crest clear in the moonlight. "Enough!" he barked, his voice cold. "Crowther wants this destroyed, not stolen." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, like a bell cutting through fog. "I think we've seen enough," she said, her eyes steady. The three froze, their faces a mix of shock and guilt. She held up the decoy vial, now in her hand, having retrieved it during the chaos. "This is plant food, not Formula X," she said. "But it's shown us who's been troubling Clara." Lionel's face crumpled, his glasses falling to the ground. Sophie's eyes widened, her camera dangling uselessly. Reginald's jaw tightened, his briefcase slipping from his grip. Miss Marple nodded to Tom, who stepped forward, his limp pronounced, but his stance firm. "Best come inside," she said. "We have much to discuss." As they filed out, Miss Marple's mind raced. The trap had worked, revealing motives, but the full truth was still buried. She tucked the decoy vial into her pocket, next to her growing collection of clues, and followed them to the house. Inside, Clara was waiting, her face pale with shock. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needle still, her voice gentle but commanding. "Someone's been after your work, Clara," she said, "but we're closer to knowing why." She looked at Lionel, Sophie, and Reginald, their faces a gallery of guilt and fear. Her notebook lay open, and she added Lionel's theft attempt, Sophie's greed, Reginald's orders, decoy vial. The greenhouse had yielded its trap, but the final pieces were still hidden. Tomorrow she would unravel them, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Truth Unearthed. The morning sun bathed Willow Cottage in a soft golden light, but the air inside was heavy with anticipation. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles silent in her lap, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of the gathered guests. The greenhouse, its glass walls scarred by broken panes, stood like a silent witness in the garden. The past days had woven a complex tapestry of clues. The threatening note, the poisoned orchid, the smashed seedlings, the buried box with Formula X, the grey button, the red petal, the glass shard, and the rose-crested letter. Her notebook, tucked beside her knitting basket, held her final observations. Lionel's theft attempt, Sophie's greed, Reginald's orders, the decoy vial. The key in her pocket, now a symbol of unlocked secrets, had led her to this moment. Today, Miss Marple would unravel the mystery and bring peace to Clara Henshaw's troubled home. Clara sat by the fire, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her face pale but resolute. Dr. Lionel Vance slouched in an armchair, his glasses smudged, his bald head gleaming with nervous sweat. Sophie Trent perched on a sofa, her notebook closed, her eyes darting like a cornered fox. Mr. Reginald Poole stood by the window, his grey suit crisp but his briefcase absent, left in the study under Miss Marple's quiet suggestion. Tom Biddle, the gardener, hovered near the door, his weathered cap in hand, his limp pronounced but his gaze steady. The tension in the room was like a taut string, ready to snap, and Miss Marple knew it was time to cut through the lies. She cleared her throat, her voice gentle but firm, like a bell ringing in a quiet village. "Thank you for gathering, my dears," she said, her eyes moving from face to face. "Clara's greenhouse has been under attack, and it's time we found the truth. Someone in this room has been breaking glass, poisoning plants and stealing secrets, but I believe I know who and why." Clara's eyes widened, her handkerchief crumpling. Lionel's glasses slipped, his hands fidgeting. Sophie's pen twitched, as if itching to write. Reginald's jaw tightened, his fingers curling. Tom shifted, his eyes on the floor. Miss Marple's knitting lay still, her mind weaving the final pattern. She began with the first incident, her voice calm but clear. It started with a broken pane and a brick, thrown from inside the greenhouse, not outside. A curious choice, meant to scare Clara without leaving footprints. She paused, her eyes on Lionel. "Dr. Vance, you were quick to blame village, boys, but your shoes were muddy that night, though the greenhouse paths are gravel." Lionel's face flushed, his voice sharp. "I was checking the plants. Clara asked me to." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but unyielding. "Perhaps. But mud suggests you were digging, maybe near the spot where I found a buried box." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "A box? In my greenhouse?" Miss Marple nodded, pulling the folded paper from her pocket, its cryptic notes about Formula X clear in Clara's handwriting. This was hidden under a bench, with a vial labelled Formula X. Someone wanted it badly. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes bright. "That's the story I've been chasing. Formula X is a breakthrough, isn't it?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "You've been chasing, Sophie, but not alone. Your phone call spoke of a source promising proof. Who were they? Sophie's cheeks reddened, her hands gripping her notebook. Just a contact, she said too quickly. They said Clara's work was big. Medicine, maybe millions. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling Sophie's sneaky return, her photos of the greenhouse, her eager questions. A journalist's ambition is a powerful thing, she said, but it can blind you to danger. Your source was leading you, Sophie, perhaps to distract you from the real prize. She turned to Reginald, her voice steady. Mr. Poole, your briefcase held a letter with a rose crest, matching Clara's invitation from Mr. Crowther. I've seen that crest before, in a case involving a businessman with questionable dealings. Reginald's face paled, his hands clenching. You're mistaken, he said, his voice dry. Crowther's just a client. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp. Then why did you argue with Lionel about meddling with the formula? And why did your letter order its destruction? The room went silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Reginald's shoulders sagged, his mask slipping. Miss Marple continued, her voice weaving the clues together. The greenhouse was a stage for sabotage. The poisoned orchid, the smashed seedlings, the toppled shelf, all meant to stop Clara's work. But why? Formula X, a plant-based compound with medical potential, was the prize. Someone wanted to claim it or destroy it. She looked at Lionel, whose glasses were now on the table, his face pale. Dr. Vance, your jealousy of Clara's success was clear. You wanted Formula X for yourself, to boost your own career. That's why you were in the greenhouse last night, trying to steal the decoy vial. Lionel's hands shook, his voice hoarse. I just wanted credit. Clara's always ahead with her funding, her orchids. I deserved a chance. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her voice soft. Lionel, you could have asked. I'd have shared. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but firm. But you broke panes and poisoned plants, thinking it would hide your theft. You left mud, a red petal, a glass shard, small mistakes that told a big story. She turned to Sophie, her voice gentle but piercing. You, Sophie, were led by ambition. Your source fed you rumours of Formula X, hoping you'd stir trouble and expose Clara's work. But you didn't see the danger. Sophie's eyes dropped, her notebook slipping to the floor. I just wanted the story, she mumbled. They said it was a scoop. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the phone calls, the small footprint, the torn leaf. Sophie was a pawn, but whose? Finally, she looked at Reginald, her voice steady. Mr. Poole, you were the key. Your letters from Crowther weren't just funding, they were orders. Crowther's no philanthropist. He's a man with a past tied to that rose crest. You were blackmailed into controlling Clara's work, weren't you? When Formula X became stable, he wanted it destroyed, fearing its power. Reginald's face crumpled, his hands shaking. He threatened me, he whispered. Said he'd ruin me if I didn't stop her. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Clara's voice broke, her eyes wide. Reginald, why didn't you tell me? He shook his head, his voice low. Crowther's dangerous. He wanted Formula X gone, said it could ruin his plans. Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the crest from a case involving a criminal who hid behind wealth. You sent the threatening note, she said, and toppled the shelf, hoping Clara would give up. The grey button, the rose crest, they pointed to you. Tom Biddle stepped forward, his cap twisting in his hands. I saw him, he said, his voice steady despite his limp. Sneaking at night, near the cabinets. Didn't want to tell, but I knew it was wrong. Miss Marple smiled at him, her eyes kind. You did well, Tom. Loyalty is a fine thing, but truth is better. She turned to Clara, her voice soft. Your work was the heart of this, dear. Formula X could heal, but it also tempted greed and fear. What will you do with it? Clara's hands trembled, but her voice was firm. I'm done with it, she said. It's caused too much pain. She stood, her eyes resolute, and led the group to the greenhouse. There, she unearthed the buried box, its vial of Formula X glinting in the sunlight. With a steady hand, she poured it into the soil, letting it soak away. No one will have it, she said, her voice strong. Not Crowther, not anyone. Miss Marple nodded, her heart warm. Clara's choice was brave, a rejection of the greed that had torn her peace apart. As the group returned to the house, Miss Marple called the village constable, a young man named Peter, who arrived promptly. Lionel, his face pale, admitted to the vandalism and theft attempts, his ambition crumbling under the weight of truth. Peter took him away, his glasses dangling in his hand. Sophie, chastened, promised to drop her story, her notebook left behind as she packed to leave. Reginald, his briefcase empty, confessed to his role, agreeing to face Crowther's consequences. Tom stayed by Clara's side, his loyalty unshaken, his limp a reminder of his quiet strength. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking once more. Clara joined her, her face lighter, as if a burden had lifted. "Thank you, Jane," she said, her voice warm. "You saved my home." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Nonsense, dear. You saved yourself." Clara offered her a rare orchid, its petals delicate and pure, and Miss Marple accepted it with a nod, her heart content. As she packed her knitting and notebook, she thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets never stayed buried for long. The greenhouse was quiet now, its glass walls clear, its shadows gone. She stepped into the garden, the orchid in her hands, and smiled. The truth was unearthed, and Willow Cottage was at peace.